My name's Emma Pemberton. I'm the Director of Consulting Services at Wellingtone, and I'm going to be talking to you today about portfolio prioritisation and the PMO. So let's get into prioritisation. So we're going to talk today about how organisations prioritise. We're going to talk about what role the PMO can have within that, uncover some tips for you to start the conversation if you're not doing this at the moment, and as well as identify some of the practical techniques that you can do right now. So I'm going to turn my camera off so that you can see my screen, and let's get into it. So in terms of how organizations prioritize, one of the things that became clear, we quite often talk about prioritization in our networking events, is that, you know, more than 30% of who prioritizes our projects is no one or who shouts loudest, which is not really the most effective way of looking at prioritization. Now, the APM talk about portfolio management as the selection, prioritization, and control of an organization's projects in line with their strategic objectives. We tend to be okay at selection. We tend to have some kind of annual planning process or biannual planning process, and we're getting better at controlling those projects. What we are not so good at the moment, I would say as an industry, is being able to effectively prioritize and, really importantly, stick to that prioritization. And as we can see here from one of our networking events, the wrong people are actually potentially prioritizing our projects. It should not be who shouts loudest. It shouldn't necessarily be the delivery managers, or in some cases, even the PMO. So we need to make sure that prioritization stops being seen as a tick box exercise. It is considered in lots of organizations as one of those processes that we do because it's the right thing to do. But as soon as people step out of the room or something changes, we reprioritize anyway within our own teams. So we need to get better at that. And that the only way to really help that is to add a little bit of governance around it. Now, we're not talking about slowing down the whole process. It's really about understanding how do we make these decisions and how do we stick to these decisions? How do we communicate that? And what do we do if something does change that is going to require something to be genuinely reprioritized? So who prioritizes projects? Maybe not the right people, but let's talk about one of those right now. So the role of the PMO. So the PMO is an organizational structure that provides support for projects, programs, and portfolio. And depending on the reality of the PMO and the reality of the organization will really depend on the culture, the structures that we have, who the PMO reports into. So for example, a very different PMO from somebody that reports into the CEO is somebody that reports into the head of commercial. So we have to be realistic about what is achievable from a PMO perspective when it comes to prioritization. Remembering that every PMO is different. Now, that is my stock answer to pretty much every question about what is or what should my PMO be, do, have. We need more information because the PMO is actually built around the people that you have there and the needs of our PMO customers. But we can take three basic levels that we see very, very often in terms of PMO and their involvement with prioritization. So if we take level one, let's call this PMOs that sit in a relatively strategic position. So they might report into a very senior person, maybe the CEO, and they are able to be in the room when that prioritization process, that conversation is happening. At this level, they will own and they will facilitate the process itself. So they will make sure that the prioritization meetings happen, that the information is correct and appropriate to go into that meeting. They will record the decisions of the prioritization, and they might even feed into the conversation in terms of risks or the change that's going on and anything else that might impact the conversation around prioritization. Now, not all PMOs are sitting at that level or have a space at that particular table. And we have to be realistic about that when we are looking at developing our, for example, PMO service catalogues. Is this an aspiration? But is it a realistic aspiration, given if, like my example, we report into the head of commercial? That's a very different room to try to get into. So let's take PMOs that maybe are a little bit more mature, but are not in that room. So they don't necessarily own and facilitate the process. They might have created the process, they might have supported embedding the process, but on an annual basis, or however often we decide to prioritize, these kinds of PMOs will ensure that they take the output and that everything that is prioritized is aligned to our strategic objectives, and it is reviewed against the risk exposure that we already have in the organization. So at level 2, we're kind of taking that input from the prioritization process. We might have had a little bit of a hand in how that works, but fundamentally, it's about ensuring confidence in this new portfolio that's coming into the organization. At level 3, let's talk about PMOs who are maybe relatively immature when it comes to prioritization. So this might be something that we're trying to do, we're aspiring to do. Maybe it's a younger PMO, we're not kind of fully fledged kind of a business partner just yet. And at this level, it might be that the PMO is in charge of, again, taking the output from that conversation and supporting the scheduling of those projects. So just because we have priority 1, 2, 3, and 4 doesn't mean that they're either all going to start together or that they're all going to start one after each other. So that this PMO will actually support with the scheduling of that set of projects, making sure that we're avoiding change fatigue, that we're not trying to do too much with too little, which is very common when we do research. It's one of our top challenges, that we're trying to do too much. So it's really the responsibility of the PMO to identify the risks with starting everything in one go on the 1st of January, if I pick an arbitrary date. Now, it's not to say that any of these levels are right or wrong. They are just reality. And it could be that your PMO sits a little bit in between some of these, and that is okay. All PMOs are different, but it's important to understand what could be our role of the PMO in prioritization. So it's important to know that before we kind of move into how can we actually start this conversation. So again, we need to take a reality check and understand that sometimes just enough governance around prioritization or process around prioritization is just enough. This is one of my PMO wisdom lessons of life, is that sometimes we don't need a Ferrari, we don't need an all singing, all dancing system. Sometimes if we're starting from zero, just enough is just enough. And we can see here an example of a very simple Excel spreadsheet that allows us to do some rudimentary prioritization. We can see that there are 3 core areas that we want to test for. These are called your drivers for priorities, and we have strategic fit. So how well do these projects individually fit into our future? What is the economic impact of these projects? And is it even feasible for us to do? That feasibility is one of the things that often gets missed when it comes to prioritization conversations. We kind of make the assumption that we have 100 projects, we have 100 people. That doesn't in reality mean we can run 100 projects, and we need to start talking about this much, much earlier in the process. So if we're starting from scratch, this might be all we need, is something to drive a conversation, to ensure that we have clear communication, both in that conversation, in that meeting, and as well as with our external stakeholders of prioritization. That includes the PMO, it includes the project delivery people, those that are contributing to projects, and those that have raised a request for some of these projects as well. The key to this kind of conversation is facilitation. So making sure that we have somebody that is relatively independent, as they can be, given that they work for the organization, who can be the critical friend of the people in the room who all have a priority 1 in their head, and it's not always the same. So this is another area where if the PMO is a facilitator, they can actually step in and support the conversation, a little bit like we do with lessons learned workshops. Now, you might say, this is not advanced enough for me. I need something a little bit meatier. So let's have a look at what something that's a bit more systematic can help us with. So within the Wellingtone Accelerator Plus, we have a prioritization module, if we call it that kind of allows us to assess each driver for priority on a score of 1 to 10, giving us two different measures. How attractive is it and how achievable is it? All of that information is then aggregated to give us a total prioritization score. Now, this is just an example. We can change, add, remove drivers, sections, information that we might want to capture. But some clients have even matured this. They've added to it by adding weightings to each driver in the background, depending on their importance, maybe even where they've come from. You know, a request from an external customer in a very customer driven organization might rank higher than something that's been found internally that needs doing. As well, the opposite of that, it might be that we have a challenge that affects our infrastructure or our digital capabilities, and actually that might score higher in our world than something that we want to do to make our customer experience better. So we can add weightings. That is something that is quite important when we look at not just what driver. Is it about strategic alignment? Is that the most important thing for us? Is it about the money? Is it about profit or growth? Or is it about actually we need to check if this is feasible enough? So understanding what are our key drivers and what are our priorities within those is going to help us to drive that weighting and give us a more precise score. What we can then do is we can surface that prioritization score in system views. So we can show that through Power BI and other tools to drive decision making and to be able to communicate this is what we have decided. Once we start to do this, whichever method we are using, it kind of makes people a little bit more accountable. So they're less likely to come out of that conversation and really kind of change their mind or start doing things under the radar, because we've had the conversation, we've agreed, we've put it into a systematic way. So we take out the human emotion part of it of this is my pet project and I really want to do it. And then by communicating it through a simple form, as we can see here, it allows then people to be accountable to that decision that they've helped to make. So whether it's an all singing, all dancing system, or whether it's an Excel spreadsheet that we have to start with, there are things that you can do to start this conversation and start to have that process in place. Now, lots of people will say, yes, but how do I sell this in? My leadership aren't that interested. They're quite happy with who shouts loudest. One of the things that we could do is start off with something simple and actually just use it for the projects that we have ongoing at the moment to give us a view on if we could go back in time, if we had a time machine, what would we have done differently? That's going to help us to see in a better world, how would we have dealt with the work we have that we're currently dealing with? And I bet you will find the reasons why actually we have some challenges with some of our existing projects, because maybe we started it at the wrong time, or it shouldn't have been as high of a priority because this other thing was always going to come and take over all of our resources. So it hopefully helps you to build a case for change and a way to have a more data-driven conversation. Now, to kind of finish us off, it's important for us to identify some of the practical techniques to get you started. So the first thing that we would say is it's important for us to make prioritization part of the day job by talking about it as an important discipline within the community. So don't keep it hidden away, making sure that it's kind of all done secret squirrel behind closed doors. We need to talk about prioritization within our community. We need to, as soon as a decision gets made, let's be as transparent as we can be with our community to say, this is what we've prioritized. It might be that we can simplify the toolkit so that they can actually use it to manage their own work, maybe, so do something slightly lighter that we can say, whether it's a project or not, you still have to deal with lots of different aspects of work. And this can actually help people to manage their time, which is a really important thing in the world where we are all time poor. And actually, most people say, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing next. The second thing is, if you have a process already, is try to get all the projects to use the process. So making sure, like I said, use it for your in-flight projects to drive a conversation, to identify where potentially we have fallen down with not doing prioritization and the impact of that. that can only help you to drive that conversation into the business. It will take time. It isn't a one-shot deal, but try to get all projects to kind of utilize the process, whether that is at a more central planning level or whether it's at a PMO level when we're starting to look at the project and set everything up. If everyone is using something, then make sure that it's appropriate and that it allows you to compare apples with apples. So we're not trying to look at every project on its own merit in the sense of, well, again, politically, this might be a really good thing to do because it's the person rather than the project. But I'm sure we've all been part of a project that was exactly that went horribly wrong. So we want to make sure that we take out that kind of human emotion, human attachment to our project, and comparing a project with a project based on proper information, proper conversation, so that we can make an actual informed decision. And if people aren't listening, if you're trying to get this message across and people are still fighting, they're still not quite on the road of prioritization is a good idea, then we need to highlight the risks of not prioritizing properly. And I'll say it again, use it to look at your existing portfolio. That's going to highlight, I would bet you, some of the risks that you are currently carrying in your portfolio. It will highlight that if we had prioritized this correctly, this maybe would have been avoidable. So really making sure that we either, if we're starting from scratch, make it part of the day job. Start talking about it now, even if you don't have a process. People still need to understand that these things need to be prioritized. If you have a process, try to get everybody to use it, make it simple, make it inclusive so that everybody could potentially use it. If everyone is using something, make sure it's the right thing and that it compares projects in the right way. And if you're still struggling with selling the idea of it, then go to the risks, highlight the risks of not prioritizing. So hopefully that's given you a whistle-stop tour of some of the things that we can do in terms of talking about prioritization, some of the tooling that might help you, as well as some of the things that you can do right now. As always, we say, stay in touch with Wellingtone, either through the community, through the Dr. PMO clinic, and make sure that you stay in touch with me. You can find me on LinkedIn if you search for PMO Ninjas. Thank you so much for joining this lunchtime webinar. Allows you to get the juices flowing a little bit, and do stay in touch and continue the conversation with Wellingtone. Thank you all.